Hello everyone, in this video I will explain my 4C cycle recognition technique that I use in the Roux method. Just a quick disclaimer, this is a technique that I came up with around 8 years ago when I first started using Roux, and till this day I don't know if this is a system that already exists, but I'm going to call this technique the chunks approach for the rest of this video. So, what is a chunk? After you solve the outer edges and align the corners, you'll get to this point. A chunk is then defined by an edge piece along the M slice that's sandwiched between two centers, so like this right here. So that means there are 4 chunk positions: the top front, the top back, the bottom front, and the bottom back. Now there are 3 types of chunks that exist. The first is what's called the block, and that's when both sides of the chunk have the same colors, so like this right here. Another example is something like this, and this is also the block. As you can see, both sides have the same colors. The next is what's called a dot, and that's when both sides of the chunk have opposite colors, so I guess right here. And another example is something like this. As you can see, both sides opposite colors. Now lastly, we have what's called the pointer, and that's when one side has the same colors and the other side has opposite colors, so it's like a half and half. Now the recipe for what makes up a cycle case is always going to be 1 block, 1 dot, and 2 pointers. The most important chunks are a block and a dot. Knowing the positions of these 2 chunks will tell you exactly how to solve a 4C cycle. So let's dive right in. But before we do that, I want to talk about what I like to call a 3 mover. And that's when you perform an M move, followed by a U2, and then another M move. And there are 2 types. The first is what's called the twist, and that's a 3 mover that consists of 2 different M's. So it can either be M prime, U2, M, or M, U2, M prime. The second is what's called the flip, and it's a 3 mover that consists of 2 same M's. So it can either be M prime, U2, M prime, or M, U2, M. Now when you perform a twist, notice how the centers don't get affected. They stay the same. So that means when you do a twist, as you can see, the centers remain the same place. When you perform a flip, however, the centers gets moved by a M2. As you can see, the centers are M2 away from being soft. When you perform a flip, it gets soft. Now this may seem pretty obvious, but this is important, and we'll come back to this later. Now let's go back to the positions of the chunks. When you get a 4C cycle, look around a cube and determine where the block and a dot is located. The first case is when a dot and a block are both on the bottom 2 chunks like this. Now the dot can be in the front, or the dot can be in the back. What we're going to do for this case is to twist the side of the dot and then a U2. So for example, if the dot is in the front, we're going to do a twist from the front. And if the dot is in the back, we're going to do a twist from the back. Now depending on the center orientation, we may have to do a M2 at the end. So take for example this case, the dot and the block are both on the bottom, so we're going to do a twist U2. But we ain't done yet, we still have to do a M2. So how do we know when to do a M2 at the end or not? Here is where knowing how the centers move when we do a twist or a flip comes in. Remember when I said we'll come back to this later? Yeah, we'll use that right now. The center property when we do a twist is that the centers remain unaffected. So in this case right here, as we can see, we have to do a twist U2, right? But we also see that the centers are not solved. So when we do a twist, the centers will remain unsolved, and that's how we know when to do a M2 at the end. Moving on, the second case is when the block and the dot are both on the top two chunks, like this. And once again, the dot can be in the back, or it can be in the front. But what we're going to do for this case is to do a flip from the dot and then a U2. So in this example, the dot is in the back, so we're going to do a flip from the back. But then what do I mean by that? What's a flip from the back mean? Well, it is precisely that. If you imagine a cube doing a backflip from your perspective, it does something like this, right? It's like this motion. So now if you imagine the M slice doing the same thing, it would be something like that. So in this example, a flip from the back will mean the M slice going in this direction. Anyway, once again, we can still run in the same problem where there might be an M2 at the end. So, in this example, just like before, the block and the dot are both on the top, so we're going to do a flip U2. But we still need an M2 to finish. And now, just like before, we'll use the center property that when we do a flip, the centers will be moved by a M2. And here we can see that the centers are solved. So now when we do a flip, we know that the centers will be M2 away. And that's how we're going to know we need an M2 at the end. The third case is when the dot is on top and the block is on the bottom. Now there are a few arrangements when this happens. In this case, they are both in the front chunks like this. But in another example, they both can be in the back chunks like this. But regardless, all you gotta know is that the block is on the bottom and the dot is on top. What we're gonna do when this happens is just to do a U2 and then a 3 mover. But how do we know what 3 mover it is? Again, look at the centers. If the centers are solved, then we know we need to do a twist so that the centers remain solved. And now if the centers are not solved, as you can see, we know that we have to do a flip. But now how do we know if it's a front twist or back flip or whatever? Well, just look at where the dot goes after a U2. In this example, the dot's going to go to the front after a U2, so now we know that it's going to be a front twist because the centers are solved. The fourth and final case is when the dot is on bottom and a block is on top. When this happens, all you gotta do is simply do an M2 to convert this into the previous case. And now the block is on bottom and the dot is on top. So just follow the steps from the previous case and we should be able to solve this for C cycle. But we can do better. If we know that we have to do an M2 to convert, and then from this case we have to do an U2, we can just bunch the two moves together and perform M2 U2 as a trigger. And now we can also figure out what 3 mover it will be from here. Once again, by looking at where the centers go after an M2, we can figure out if it's a flip or a twist. In this case, the centers are solved, so after an M2, the centers will be not solved. So we need to do a flip. But what flip is it? Well, just look at where the dot is. In this example, the dot is in front, so we have to do a front flip. So the solution will be M2 U2 and then front flip. Alright, now let's get in some examples to demonstrate a chunks approach in action, and also to show my thought process and how I recognize the cases. So for our first example, we always want to find where the dot on the block is. As we can see, the dot is on the bottom, and the block is also on the bottom, so now we know it's going to be a twist U2. But we also see that the centers are already solved, That means that if we do a twist, that will remain solved, so we don't have to do an M2 at the end. Then the solution will be simply twist U2. Now our next example, again we find where the dot on the block is. The dot is on the bottom, and the block is on top. Now we know it's going to be a M2 U2 3 mover. As for what 3 mover it is, after the M2, the centers will be not solved. So now it's going to be, we know it's going to be a flip. As for where to flip, the dot's in the back, so it's going to be a back flip. So the solution is just going to be M2 U2, back flip. And next, again we find where the dot on the block is. The dot is on top, and the block is on bottom. So it's going to be a U2 3 mover. And as for what 3 mover it is, the centers are not solved, so now we know it's going to be a flip. And the dot is going to come to the front when we do a U2, so it's going to be a front flip. So then it's going to be like this, U2, front flip. Our last example, we see that the block is already on top, and the dot is also on top. So now we know it's going to be a flip U2. We see that the centers are going to be an M2 away when we do a flip. So that means we know at the end there's going to be a M2. So then the solution is just going to be flip U2, M2. When you're first learning the chunks approach, it is okay to look around the whole cube to find where the dot and the block is and figure out the case, and that's perfectly fine. Now the goal is to be able to perform 4C cycles blindfolded at max TPS. So in order to master this technique, after figuring out the case, don't make any moves, close your eyes, and turn as fast as you can. After you open your eyes, the cube should be solved. If you can do this consistently and be able to recognize the cases really fast, then you have met the prerequisite to move on to the rest of this video. Okay, so now how do we solve the problem of having to scan the whole cube in order to figure out the dot and the block? Enter the 3 laws of the chunks approach. The first law is the law of the dot and block, and it states that the dot and block are always going to be next to each other. So for example, take this case here. If we know that this is the dot, then we know that the block has to be either this chunk here or this chunk in the back, and it can never be diagonally away. So now if we figure out that this is not the block, then we immediately know that the block has to be in this back chunk here. The second law is the law of the pointer, and it states that the pointer will always point towards another pointer or point towards the block. And how I like to think about this chunk is that the solid color, imagine a solid color is like an arrow, and it points towards the chunk in front of it. So like this right here, this is an arrow, and it points towards this chunk, and this chunk points towards the block. So then if we figure out that this is a pointer, then that means that this chunk right here has to be either the block or another pointer. Now if we know that this is another pointer, then we can rule out this chunk as a pointer, and we now know that this must be the block. By using these 2 laws, we can easily deduce what case it might be if we have the necessary information. But how much information do we need? The third law of the chunks approach is a law of information, and it states that knowing only 2 chunks, regardless of type or position, is enough to determine the case. So then all we need is to find a reliable way to figure out 2 chunks, and we're good. And you may already noticed, after we solve the LR edges, we have been already given a freebie, and that's by this chunk in front of us. As you can see, we know the 2 sides of this chunk. So now we know 1 chunk of information. Now we just need to know another chunk. And the gold mine of information is when the LR edges are on the bottom like this, and are M2 away from being solved. Now if we look at this chunk in front of us and track where it goes, after the M2, it goes in the back. And it stays there even after we align the corners. And if we look at what this chunk is, as you can see, both sides are opposite colors, so this is the dot. We do an M2 in the line, we look at the bottom, as you can see it is still a dot. So now we know this chunk here and this freebie at the top, and that's two chunks of information, and we should be able to figure out this case. However, what I recommend and what is the easiest to know is two chunks that are adjacent to each other. And right here we know this chunk, and it's two chunks that are diagonally away. And yeah, you can still figure out the case, but I find it to be a bit harder. Now back in the M2 position, instead what I recommend and what I use is to look at this back sticker and the center. Now these two could be the same colors, like in this example, or they could be opposite colors, but whatever it may be, after doing M2, that's going to be the side of this chunk in front of us. Right here we see that these two are the same colors. That means after the M2, the bottom side of the bottom front chunk is going to be the same colors. So if this side is same and this side is same, we know this is a block. And if we take the freebie in front of us, that is two pieces of information. And now we should be able to figure out the case. Alright, now for some more examples. This time we will start from the M2 away. We'll look at these two stickers and notice that they're the same colors. So after the M2, the bottom side of the bottom front chunk must be the same colors. So if the same and the same, this must be the block. And by using the first law, the dot has to be next to it, so it can either be in here or here. We see that this is not the dot, so the dot has to be in the back bottom. Now I'm able to figure out where the block and the dot is without having the need to scan the whole cube. I'm going to show you guys that that is indeed correct. As to how to solve this case, I'm not going to go into too much detail because at this point you should be pretty good at recognizing cases. So I'm going to go really fast. They're both on the bottom, so it's going to be a twist U2. The centers are solved, so no need for M2 at the end. Next example, these two stickers are the same. After M2, the bottom side of this chunk must be the same. So if the same and opposites, this chunk must be the pointer. And now we also see that this chunk in front of us is also a pointer. So by the second law, this chunk in the back top must be the block. And that also means that the dot has to be in the back bottom. So to do this case, it's going to be M2 U2 3 mover. The centers will not be solved after M2, so it's going to be a flip. Next, these two stickers here are now opposite colors. So after M2, the bottom side here must be opposite colors. So if opposites and opposites, this must be the dot. Now we also see that this is a block, so this means this is an M2 U2 3 mover. The centers will be solved after the M2, so it's going to be a twist. Our last example, we see that these two stickers are opposites. So after M2, this sticker down here is all opposites. So if opposites and the same, this is a pointer. And in the freebie, we also see this is also a pointer. So by the second law, this pointer points to this chunk points to this chunk in the back bottom. That means that this must be the block. And that means this is the dot. Just to confirm, that is indeed correct. To do this case, use a U2 3 mover. That will go here, so it's going to be a flip. So, why should I learn this? What edge does it have against other 4C cycle recognition methods like BU or DFDB? Now, I don't use other methods, but I have tried DFDB before, and what I can say is that if I have known DFDB before I came up with this method, then I probably would have used DFDB. It is a really good system. But I will say, and this may be biased because I created this method, is that Chunk's approach is on par with DFDB, and if not better. Again, I may be biased here, I'm not the best at DFDB, and so this is why I'm sharing this, hoping that other Roux users will find this video, and I'll let you guys decide whether or not this is a viable method as a means of recognizing 4C cycles. Now, being objectively here, what I think is the pro to using this method is the high TPS at the end of your solve. I don't know if other recognition methods can yield just as high of TPS, but using this method you can for sure spam as fast as you can once you know the case. You'll be just like PLL in CFOP. Another pro, and what I argue is what the Chunk's approach is the best at, is handling cancellations such as this. In this example, an LR edge is on the bottom back right here, and the other LR edge is on the top here, and you're trying to insert the last LR edge to the bottom, like this. However, you see that there's a bar right here. Now you know you can cancel, and instead of putting them both on the bottom, you put them both on the top like this. Now I won't go into too in depth as to how to handle cancellations in this video, because that's going to be a topic for my next video. As for the cons, one of them is this long pause right here, and this pause happens for two reasons. One of them is to figure out where the dot and the block is, and the second is to know how to perform the case. Now this pause can be reduced significantly with practice and look ahead, but it is still there even for me. The other con is the U2. This approach assumes U to solve the corners, so that's a U, but in this case where there's the dot is on top and the block is on bottom, you have to do a U2, and that's a redundant move right there. If this is a deal breaker for you for learning this method, then that's fine. I still do U2 from time to time, but it can be mitigated with experience. And if it does happen, it is not the end of the world. You can perform this really fast. Now, as for some proof, I can get low 2s to sub 2 LSC solves on CS timer pretty consistently. But I do know EOLR, and that might be the only reason why I'm so fast. Anyways, that's it. Hopefully you find this video useful, and have a wonderful day.